Hey everyone, this is one of those stories that starts quietly, with a number most people laugh at and a woman most people underestimate. Before the world knew the outcome, before success had a name, there was only a decision, a tired heart and $800 sitting in a place where fear and faith were fighting for control. If you believe in stories where doubt becomes fuel and judgment turns into silence, take a second to like, subscribe and center yourself, because you are now entering a rise that could not be stopped. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion. This story begins in a season of exhaustion. Not the kind that comes from one bad week, but the kind that builds after years of being overlooked, undervalued, and expected to accept less with a smile. She had worked hard, played by the rules she was told mattered, and still found herself boxed in by ceilings she never agreed to. Every step forward felt watched. Every idea felt judged before it even had a chance to breathe. People did not need to hear her plan to doubt her. They doubted her simply because she existed with ambition. The $800 did not fall from the sky. It was gathered slowly, painfully from sacrifices that never made headlines. Skipped comforts, delayed joy, quiet nights when rest was replaced with planning. That money carried weight because it represented choice. It represented the last clean line between continuing to survive or finally attempting to build something that belonged to her. And when people found out she was thinking of using it to start something of her own, their reactions were predictable. Not loud opposition but soft disbelief. The kind that smiles while it dismisses. The kind that says waste without ever using the word. They said it was not enough. They said it would disappear. They said the world was not kind to people like her who tried to do things differently. They said she should save it for emergencies, not dreams. They said a platform was for people with money, connections, and permission. What they really said was that she should know her place and stay there. But what they did not understand was that she had already survived emergencies far worse than financial risk, and she was done shrinking her future to make others comfortable. She did not announce her move. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She took the $800 and treated it like a seed, not a lottery ticket. Every decision was intentional. Nothing was rushed. She studied quietly, learning what others took years to figure out through mistakes. She invested in tools, not appearances. She invested in structure, not noise. She understood that success was not about looking powerful, but about building something that could not be shaken once it stood. At first, nothing seemed to happen. No applause. No sudden growth. Just long days of work and longer nights of doubt trying to sneak back in. There were moments when the silence felt louder than the critics. Moments when the number in her account made her question whether belief alone was enough. But she kept going because quitting would have proven them right and continuing meant she still had the pen in her hand. The platform began as an idea rooted in truth. A space where her voice did not have to be filtered. A place where stories like hers were not treated as exceptions but as evidence. She built it brick by brick, learning how to speak without asking permission, how to show up without apologizing, and how to create value without waiting for validation. The $800 stretched because she stretched herself. Every dollar worked because she worked. Slowly something shifted. Not in numbers at first but in energy. People began to notice. Not because she chased attention but because authenticity has a way of pulling eyes toward it. Her work started landing where it was meant to. The platform began to breathe on its own. It carried her voice farther than she expected and deeper than she imagined. And with every small win, the doubt that once surrounded her began to thin. What no one saw was how many times she almost stopped. How many times fear dressed itself up as logic and tried to convince her to retreat. But each time she remembered why she started. She remembered the way people looked at her dreams like they were childish. She remembered the way $800 had been labeled a mistake before it was ever spent. And she chose to keep building not out of spite but out of purpose. By the end of that first phase, the $800 had not just survived. It had multiplied in ways that could not be measured only by money. It had created confidence. It had created reach. It had created proof. Proof that she did not need approval to be powerful. Proof that belief backed by action could outgrow skepticism every single time. As the foundation settled and the platform began to stand tall, something else became clear. This was no longer just about her. This was about what happens when a Black woman decides to trust herself louder than the noise around her. And as the first real signs of success appeared, the same people who doubted began to watch more closely, sensing that the story was no longer going the way they expected. The rise had only just begun and the silence that followed was not peace. It was anticipation. The moment the platform began to move, the energy around her shifted. Growth has a way of changing the room without asking permission. And suddenly the same silence that once ignored her became a form of observation. People were watching now. Not cheering, not supporting, just watching closely, trying to understand how something they had dismissed was starting to take shape. Success had not arrived loudly, but it had arrived steadily, and that steadiness made people uneasy. What she learned quickly was that progress attracts two things at the same time: opportunity and resistance. As the platform gained momentum, the workload doubled. What once felt like a personal mission now carried responsibility. There were expectations even if they were unspoken. There were people who found strength in her work, who felt seen by the space she created. That realization added weight to every decision. She was no longer building only for herself. She was building for those who had never been centered before. The $800 had long been spent, but its impact was still unfolding. It had paid for access, for education, for tools that amplified her reach. It had given her a seat at tables she was never invited to before. But those tables were not always welcoming. Some smiled politely while questioning her presence. Others pretended not to notice her at all. Yet every time she showed up prepared, informed, and unapologetic, she disrupted the narrative they were comfortable with. There were days when growth felt overwhelming. Messages came in faster than she could respond. Opportunities appeared that required courage she was still developing. The platform demanded consistency, vision, and emotional strength. And still she showed up. Not perfectly but honestly. She refused to dilute her voice to fit expectations. She refused to soften her truth to make it easier to digest. That refusal became her signature. Behind the scenes, the critics evolved. The doubts were no longer about the money. They were about sustainability. They whispered that this momentum would not last, that attention fades, that platforms crumble. Some tried to attach conditions to their support, suggesting changes that would make her work more palatable, more familiar, more controlled. She listened, but she did not bend. She understood that compromise without alignment was just another form of erasure. What strengthened her most was the realization that discomfort was proof of expansion. Every time she stepped into a new level, something inside her resisted before it adapted. Growth was not smooth. It required unlearning habits built for survival, not success. It required trusting her instincts even when the path ahead was unclear. And it required accepting that not everyone who clapped at the beginning would still be present as the stakes got higher. The platform began to reflect her discipline. Metrics grew. Engagement deepened. The message traveled beyond her immediate circle and reached people she never imagined impacting. Stories began to mirror her own journey, coming from others who had been told they were dreaming too big with too little. Her success became evidence, and evidence is powerful. It does not argue. It exists. With visibility came scrutiny. Every move was observed, analyzed, sometimes misunderstood. She learned quickly that being seen meant being judged, but she also learned that invisibility had never protected her before. She chose visibility with intention. She refined her systems, strengthened her boundaries, and invested back into what she was building. This was no longer a gamble. It was a strategy unfolding in real time. There were moments of isolation. Leadership often is lonely, especially when it challenges the status quo. She missed the comfort of anonymity, the simplicity of being underestimated. But she did not miss the limitation. She reminded herself daily that this version of discomfort was earned. It was the kind that comes with growth, not stagnation. As the platform matured, so did she. Confidence replaced hesitation. Clarity replaced confusion. She began to see the bigger picture, understanding that this was not just a personal win but a blueprint. A reminder that access can be created, that permission is often self-issued, and that small beginnings do not dictate small outcomes. The critics grew quieter not because they changed their minds, but because the story was no longer theirs to narrate. The numbers spoke. The impact spoke. The consistency spoke. And in that silence she found a new kind of power. Not the power to prove people wrong, but the power to move forward without needing their approval. Yet just as stability began to settle in, a new challenge emerged. Growth attracted attention beyond admiration. It invited competition, comparison, and subtle attempts to undermine what she had built. The platform was strong, but the next phase would test her resilience in ways she had not yet faced. She stood at the edge of another transition, aware that success was not a destination, but a series of thresholds. And as she prepared to step into the next one, she knew that the lessons ahead would demand even more of her vision, discipline, and courage. The foundation was set. The eyes were watching. And the real test of power was about to begin. By the time the platform reached its next level, pressure was no longer occasional. It was constant. Success had tightened the spotlight, and with it came expectations that no one had prepared her for. What once felt like freedom now demanded precision. Every move mattered. Every pause was noticed. And every win was quietly weighed by those waiting to see if she would slip. Pressure has a way of exposing truth. It does not create character, it reveals it. Under the weight of growth, she discovered parts of herself that had been dormant for years. Strength sharpened by struggle. Discipline forged by necessity. Vision refined by responsibility. She realized that building something meaningful meant carrying it through seasons when excitement faded and endurance took its place. The platform had grown beyond a personal project. It was now a presence, a brand, a symbol. And symbols make people uncomfortable when they do not fit familiar narratives. She was not following the traditional script. She was not waiting her turn. She was not asking to be included. She had created her own lane, and that independence unsettled those who benefited from the old order. Opportunities increased, but so did obstacles. Some doors opened halfway, offering visibility without respect. Others tested her boundaries, seeing how much she would tolerate to stay in the room. She learned quickly that access without authority was a trap. She chose alignment over exposure even when turning things down felt risky. That decision cost her in the short term but protected her in the long run. Behind the scenes, the workload became heavier. Systems that once worked began to strain under expansion. She faced moments where everything felt one step from collapsing. Doubt returned, not as loud as before but more cunning. It questioned timing, sustainability, and worth. It asked whether she had reached her limit. But this time doubt did not paralyze her. It informed her. It showed her where to strengthen, not where to stop. She invested again, not recklessly but strategically. Time, energy, and resources were redirected toward stability. She learned to delegate, to trust others without losing control of her vision. Leadership required letting go of perfection and embracing progress. That lesson did not come easily, but it came honestly. The audience evolved too. What began as curiosity turned into loyalty. People were no longer just watching her journey, they were learning from it. Her platform became a mirror and a map, reflecting shared experiences and pointing toward possibility. That responsibility grounded her. It reminded her that this was bigger than validation. It was about legacy. Not everyone celebrated that evolution. Comparisons surfaced. Whispers followed. Some tried to recreate what she built without understanding the work behind it. Others questioned her authenticity as if success somehow erased struggle. She did not respond. She understood that explanation was unnecessary when consistency was visible. Silence, when chosen intentionally, can be louder than defense. Pressure taught her how to protect her peace. She set boundaries that others did not like but desperately needed. She limited access to her energy. She prioritized rest as a strategy, not a luxury. Burnout was not an option. She had come too far to be undone by exhaustion. There were nights when the weight felt unbearable. Nights when she wondered if the $800 that started it all had quietly transformed into a responsibility she could not put down. But every morning she returned to her purpose. Not because it was easy but because it was hers. Ownership gave her courage when motivation ran dry. The platform reached milestones that once felt impossible. Recognition followed. Not the loud applause she imagined, but the kind that changes how rooms respond when she enters. She noticed the shift in tone, the subtle recalibration of respect. The same people who doubted her judgment now studied her strategy. The same ones who dismissed her investment now questioned their own hesitation. Yet she remained grounded. She remembered where this began. A decision. $800. A refusal to stay small. Pressure had not broken her. It had refined her. It had stripped away fear disguised as caution and replaced it with clarity. As she stood firmly in her power, she sensed another shift approaching. Success had proven itself, but sustainability would demand transformation. The next chapter would not be about survival or proof. It would be about control, expansion, and claiming authority over everything she had built. The queen had been tested by pressure and emerged sharper, steadier, and more certain than ever before. By the time she reached this stage, survival was no longer the question. Control was. The platform was strong, the audience was loyal, and the results were undeniable. What remained was mastery. Mastery over her time, her narrative, and the systems that would determine whether this success stayed temporary or became generational. She understood now that growth without structure was just momentum waiting to collapse. She shifted from doing everything herself to designing how everything worked. This was the phase where vision became architecture. He studied patterns, not trends. She focused on sustainability, not applause. Every process was refined, every weakness examined. The discipline that once kept her afloat now allowed her to lead with intention instead of urgency. Power revealed itself in subtle ways. It was in the confidence to say no without explanation. It was in choosing partnerships that respected her values instead of draining them. It was in understanding that being visible did not require being accessible to everyone. She stopped chasing validation and started commanding alignment. That shift changed everything. Her platform matured into an ecosystem. It no longer relied solely on her presence to function. It created opportunities, conversations, and value even when she stepped back. That independence was intentional. She was not building something that needed her exhaustion to survive. She was building something that reflected her wisdom. The critics had nothing left to say. The narrative they expected had collapsed under the weight of evidence. $800 had not been wasted. It had been multiplied, leveraged, and transformed into influence. Not the kind that fades with attention, but the kind that reshapes perspective. Her success forced a reckoning. It challenged assumptions about who gets to build, who gets to lead, and who gets to win. She became selective about where her energy went. Not because she felt superior, but because she finally understood her worth. Every yes had a cost. Every commitment demanded presence. She learned that protecting her focus was an act of self-respect. That lesson alone elevated her leadership. What once felt like pressure now felt like purpose. She mentored quietly, shared strategically, and invested intentionally. She knew that legacy was not built by hoarding knowledge but by circulating it. The platform began to lift others, creating space where voices long ignored could be heard without distortion. There was a moment when she looked back and barely recognized the woman who hesitated over $800. Not because that woman was weak, but because she was brave without proof. That bravery had been the spark. Everything else was built from that first refusal to believe the limits placed on her. Power, she learned, was not loud. It was calm. It did not need to announce itself. It was felt in rooms that suddenly listened differently. It was seen in decisions that shaped outcomes rather than reacting to them. She no longer chased opportunity. Opportunity adjusted to her standards. The platform expanded its reach, but more importantly, it deepened its impact. People did not just consume her work, they applied it. Stories of transformation echoed her own beginnings. The ripple effect was real. $800 had become a catalyst, not just for one success story but for many. Yet she knew this was not the end. Mastery was not a finish line. It was a responsibility. The higher she rose, the clearer it became that the final phase was not about growth in size, but growth in meaning. The question was no longer how far she could go, but how intentionally she could lead. As she prepared for what came next, she felt grounded rather than restless. Confident rather than cautious. The platform was no longer proving anything. It was standing as evidence. And she was ready to close this chapter not with celebration but with clarity. Because the final chapter would not be about the money, the critics, or the climb. It would be about ownership of the story and the freedom that came with it. The queen had claimed her power. The legacy was already in motion. The last phase of the journey was not about proving herself anymore. It was about fully inhabiting the life she had built. $800, once seen as insignificant, had blossomed into a platform that carried not only her voice but the echoes of countless others who had been silenced, overlooked, or underestimated. Every late night, every calculated risk, every refusal to shrink had culminated in a presence so undeniable that even the harshest critics had no choice but to acknowledge it, quietly, begrudgingly, or with awe. Freedom, she realized, was more than financial success. It was autonomy over her time, her decisions, and her energy. It was waking up knowing that every move she made was aligned with her vision rather than dictated by someone else's expectations. Freedom was choosing her battles, her partnerships, her words. It was the absence of the need to justify her existence or her choices. And that liberation was sweeter than any applause or recognition could ever be. The platform she had nurtured was no longer a project. It had become an institution. Its influence grew organically, touching lives in ways that could not always be quantified. The stories she shared were no longer just about her own rise but about creating a blueprint for others to follow. People wrote to her with gratitude, inspired by her courage, motivated by the way she had turned scarcity into strategy. Every testimony, every acknowledgement reinforced that her journey had transcended personal ambition. It had become a movement. The critics, once relentless, had been reduced to a quiet hum in the background. Their predictions of failure had proven futile because she had learned early on that success is silent until it cannot be ignored. And when it can be ignored no longer, there is no need for retaliation. Results alone speak louder than words ever could. $800 had become more than an investment. It had become proof that vision, discipline, and resilience are currencies the world cannot devalue. She reflected on the sacrifices, the doubters, and the long nights. Every moment that tested her resolve was now evidence of her growth. Every risk taken, every choice that defied expectation had sculpted her into someone who could withstand scrutiny, harness influence, and claim authority without hesitation. She understood in the deepest way that wealth is temporary but impact is lasting. What she had built could outlive her presence, shaping the trajectory of others who came after. Freedom came with a new responsibility: stewardship. She could not only celebrate her own success but also cultivate an ecosystem that empowered others to rise. Her platform expanded its mission to mentor, to teach, and to amplify voices that had long been sidelined. She made it clear that this was not about her alone. It was about building a space where ambition, creativity, and courage could thrive without apology. That kind of freedom cannot be bought. It must be earned, nurtured, and protected. As she looked at the empire she had built, the transformation was unmistakable. The woman who hesitated over $800 now stood as a model of calculated risk, strategic growth, and unstoppable perseverance. What once seemed small had become monumental. What once seemed impossible had become inevitable. And in that inevitability she found the final piece of her crown: the quiet confidence of someone who knows they are exactly where they are meant to be. The journey had taught her that success is rarely linear. It is messy, demanding, and often invisible to the outside world. But with patience, focus, and unwavering belief, what begins as a modest step can evolve into a defining legacy. Critics may come and go, circumstances may shift, and challenges may arise. But when purpose drives action, the result is timeless. In the end, she realized the greatest return on that initial $800 was not the platform, the numbers, or the recognition. It was the proof that she could trust herself, claim her power, and transform limitations into freedom. Every lesson, every struggle, every strategic move converged into a life that could no longer be questioned. The crown was no longer symbolic. It was real. She had earned it, and nothing and no one could take it away. The story did not end because her journey ended. It ended because she had reached a place where her voice, her influence, and her freedom were undeniable. And in that undeniable truth she found the ultimate victory. A life built on her terms, fueled by her courage, and celebrated not just by her, but by everyone who had watched her rise. She had turned $800 into success, criticism into fuel, and skepticism into admiration. She had proven that power is not given, it is claimed. That freedom is not granted, it is created. And that a queen who refuses to bow can change everything.